Hello and welcome to the polling station. A lot of brightness in the room. For me, I'm in the west coast of Ireland. A lot of brightness in William Kedjanyi's room. He's about to board a train. Is there brightness? Is there brightness in the future for Boris Johnson? Not good. The YouGov poll suggests that in the traditional Conservative heartlands, there could be a big slide in terms of the Conservative vote. Not necessarily being picked up in terms of a Labour surge, but also the Greens. And so a lot of interesting things happening in terms of this YouGov poll, which is commissioned for the Times. Where does this leave Boris? And this is primarily, we're talking about pro-Remain constituencies with quite well-educated and college-going electorate. So, William Kedjanyi, what does all this mean? Tell me about this poll. I find this fascinating and very, very worrying, I would argue, for the Conservatives as well, to crunch the figures. These are 53 seat strong cluster of constituencies across the South. This is from 2019, the election. And the South and East of England, which are currently held by the Conservatives, votes Remain in 2016, have a higher than average concentration of degree holders in the population. Where is the blue wall going?
Morning. It's a really interesting question. Now, of course, we've talked a lot here about the red wall. Everybody knows those to be former Labour heartlands that the Conservatives won, many of them for the first time in 2019. This is the blue wall. To give a definition, thanks to Patrick English of YouGov, former Betting People interviewee, very much friend of the show.
Yes, we'll get him on again.
Hopefully, yes. We will define the blue wall, or YouGov will define the blue wall, as seats in the south and east of England, which are currently held by the Conservatives, voted to Remain in 2016 and have a higher than average concentration of degree holders in the population. That average is 25% plus. Now, on the screen now, you will see basically a set of bar charts. The lighter figures are the 2019 general election vote share in these blue wall constituencies. The current voting intention is in bold, and you can see that the Tories have fallen 8 points. And there has been notable rise for the Greens, as you said earlier. They've risen 7 points to 9, and Labour have risen 4 points. So they're falling almost twice as fast in the blue wall as they are nationally. However, that is a different context because those poll leads appear, or those poll falls, I should say, appear to be steadying. We'll talk more a bit about that in coming episodes to come. But this is an interesting follow-on from Cheshire and Amersham, where the Conservatives had a massive defeat, which was, I do not think, really well expected or well picked up by the markets. Maybe people on the ground knew ahead of time. Certainly the Lib Dems had a bit more confidence with it, but in terms of the wider betting markets, that was, I think it was fair to say, a bit of a shock. So how does that translate to actual seats? It means the Conservatives, if an election was hypothetically held tomorrow, could lose 16 seats, up to 16 seats. That's based on a uniform swing. There's a map here, and you'll see that quite a few of them are blue, which is safe for now, but there are also quite a few which are knife edge. The lighter blue is knife edge, and the red would be losses to Labour, and those pockets, that little pocket there of yellow, would be a loss to Lib Dems. So why does this matter? It matters for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's always, I think, quite important to be able to, especially if you are looking long term at a general election, or indeed if you just want to trade, and we're in a bit of a fallow season now, but Parliament will come back in September, ahead of general elections in the future. Also for potential by-elections, somebody who was looking at the trend in the blue wall, who might have been, looking at the data there, could have seen something like Cheshire and Amersham happening. The closer you are to the ground for these things, the more of an edge you get when looking at political betting. And also, I think it's interesting to note, there are some really, really important questions which are answered here down below in the results. For instance, there's support for plenty of what you might say were liberal progressive policy positions on cultural issues. It's interesting to note that both the red wall and the blue wall, as defined by YouGov, believe that tackling global warming should be a top priority for the government. It's also very interesting to note that there's a big support there for the idea that the government has handled Brexit badly, and also that it was the wrong decision in the first place. Now, you might say this is all going back to 2016. Why does this matter? My response to that would be that we are in 2021 now, but this appears to have created a divide which has binded voters together, much like you have pro-independence voters in Scotland, and the SNP has a majority because it's able to retain all of that vote core. The Conservatives now, I would argue, would be a party made up of Leavers, and it's possible you could see some changeovers. So whilst they solidify in the red wall, they might drop back in the blue wall. If that continues, if a drop-off continues at that rate, I don't think it will, but if it was to, and I think it's worth watching, come the time of the next election, which may not be far away, or come the time of the next by-election, you could see some really interesting betting opportunities. And it's interesting to note, when we had local elections, and there were more markets in local elections than ever this year, where did Labour do best? In the south of England and the east of England, apart from, of course, Tracy Brabin and Andy Burnham up north.
So obviously, Keir Starmer will take a lot of, I think, hope from this. But the interesting spike for the Greens as well, could this indicate some sort of a shift longer term in terms of British politics, that it won't be just one or the other? Because obviously, I mean, it was just interesting reading at the weekend an article Marion McKeown wrote in the Sunday Business Post, where she was on about basically the Conservatives trying to, block all the things Biden is trying to do and so forth. Which just glibly put into the article that like vast parts of the eastern parts of the US will probably soon be underwater, and it was just kind of thrown into a piece. And then there was a piece in Ireland as well, where parts of the eastern seaboard in Dublin could well be underwater in 2050. And you're like, well, this is exceptionally alarming. But all this stuff is it's been magnified obviously in the media now, and I guess that's evinced in these figures as well, that the Greens are picking up support.
Yeah, there's no surprise. I think, like we discussed 2 or 3 episodes back, you are probably likely to see environmental issues become even more important as an issue upon which people decide their vote. There already is, a great deal of seriousness amongst voters in Britain about the state the climate is in. It's just that it sometimes isn't seen as the top voting issue because it's not constantly, I would argue, the main news issue, if it makes sense. The pandemic is sometimes ahead of it, or sometimes it can be things like Brexit, which is ahead of it. But people do think about it. They do back serious action. It's not going to be a surprise that the Greens pick up votes from any party, to be honest with you, even though I would expect most of those votes are coming from Labour, possibly disaffected Labour members who are happy with Starmer's leadership. They might be going there. I wouldn't be amazed if some Lib Dems also went to backing Green. So that's not a surprise. It's interesting to note the amount of constituencies in which Green Party candidates did well in the local elections earlier this year. It's also interesting to note that they're on the rise across the board as well, not just in the south of England. They are on the rise across the board. I think it's very much worth looking at. Also, there is going to be a new Green Party leader. Green Party co-leaders, forgive me. That's a big job. That's going to be a big job for the person who inherits it, because Jonathan Bartley and his co-leader, who I'm unfortunately blanking on now, had actually left the party in a pretty decent position in terms of their Westminster voting intention. I believe it might have been Caroline Lucas. I'm sure I got that wrong. And whoever takes over that mantle is going to take a party which presumably is gaining a membership and gaining a bit of influence. Interesting to see who wins that and what their stance is on other issues as well.
Does this cause unease in the Conservative Party in the higher circles, this poll finding? And for me, Boris is essentially a car crash waiting to happen. I'm amazed that he's, he has this power of the Conservative Party. I think he's an idiot, and I think something will go spectacularly wrong. But will there be any sort of pressure on his leadership going forward with results like this after 2 by-election defeats as well?
No, because the Tories have huge majority, and still they have really a rather big national lead. If you had an election tomorrow, I think there's no way they wouldn't get a majority again. But longer term, if these trends keep continuing, it's potentially problematic if Labour can get within striking distance. But then you have the sort of catch-22 of Green support increasing across areas. Who's that's taking away from Labour? The same possibly for the Lib Dems. These parties are biting away at each other. The Tories have a very solid vote. However, I do notice, and it's a good segue, there has been a lot of talk about Rishi Sunak politically again, and his ambitions, and the fact that he wants to be seen very much to be his own man, to have his own economic policies, and he isn't afraid to get into battles with Boris Johnson and Downing Street. Sunak is 9-4 to be next leader. Everything's cooled off a bit. There were long periods where he was an 11-8 or 6-4 favourite. This was at the peak of the pandemic, at the peak of the first wave. Things have calmed down a bit on that point now, but it's going to be a big autumn for fiscal decisions. It wouldn't surprise me to see more market movement around Rishi Sunak. He, I think, still polls the best of any politician during the pandemic. So would that 9-4 be like to come under pressure? Potentially. But it's something worth looking at, I think, even though I don't see a challenge being particularly near for either Rishi Sunak or now Keir Starmer.
And Boris will obviously be hoping for, an economic lift out of the pandemic as well, which will obviously kind of solidify the support to some extent, because Brexit is still a major sort of elephant in the room from my perspective.
Yeah, it is. And as you see with the issues in Northern Ireland, there are going to be after effects of it that have a knock-on for basically the foreseeable future. It just depends, I think, who's hit. Is it something that people feel in Tory heartlands? There is some discontent about it. Look at the polling we've just showed you today. But in terms of across England, is it something that hits most people's pockets or that people blame the government for? I think we're a far way away from that point yet. So I think most of the upset at leaving the EU is either amongst Labour voters still in the party or in Northern Ireland and Scotland.
Just briefly before you go, how is the ending of restrictions going? Nearly 2.5 weeks in now.
Actually seems to be going better from a health perspective than many had feared, me included. We have had case drops. We're at about, I think it's 22,000 or so a day. It was rising exponentially, and I thought it was an absolute hundreds on shot to go to 100,000 cases a day. That there is still pressure on hospitals, particularly in regions like the northeast. Particularly in some areas I'm noticing in the southwest where a lot of people have come for holidays, but the admissions have begun to fall. So you can never be certain about these things. It's week on week. There's a lag as well from cases to effects. But that said, I think we've had 2 weeks now since the full reopening, and it's definitely going better than many people would feared, including me, but you can never really predict the pandemic too well.
In Boris we trust.
Well, that's the large choice in England, unfortunately. Unfortunately for me, but that is the case. And so far, touch wood, it's all right.
Thank you for your time, William.
Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, we'll be back next week with the polling station. A lot more interesting. It just never seems to be boring at all under Boris's reign. And we'll chat to you next week.